Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. Quite the Friday at the Belgian Grand Prix. Major new rumours as to what's going on with Max Verstappen, with a disaster day, especially for Mercedes, but not a day that Lewis Hamilton will want to remember for a couple of different reasons. A lockup in the first part of qualifying that puts him out of the sprint qualifying far earlier than he would have expected, and his lap record from 2020 taken apart by the MCL 39 and Oscar Piastri. Very much enjoy your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I'd greatly appreciate it. Let's begin here. This is Laura Mecki's. Of course, Red Bull are going to be a very different outfit from this point forward. It feels already like they're a little bit of a different team, especially once Max leaves, which he will do eventually, but probably not immediately. Mecki's, though, does seem to be more on board with Yuki and kind of sticking by him. Yuki had a good opportunity today in that SQ2 session if, shall we say, the track evolution went differently and Yuki was out at a different time. And to be fair to Yuki, he actually had the upgrades, because the poor guy is yet again behind the curve. They've got a new front wing, they've got like floor changes and stuff, but Yuki was informed yesterday, actually the day before yesterday, because this is the 24th, that he will not have the upgrades for the car that Max has. So kind of unfortunate, it is what it is. Red Bull have to recognise that when it comes to dissecting his current performance, and these are the upgrades that Red Bull brought. Front wing, couple of side pod changes for reliability, front suspension, rear corner. So quite a few changes they've made. It doesn't seem like Yuki has many, if any, of these. So kind of unfortunate, but I guess he'll get them in due course. As a result of that, there was plenty of flow viz on the car. As well, you can see this front wing has been heavily trimmed out. They've almost like taken a chainsaw to it and just cut this top element of the wing off. Now, that means that Max is rapid in a straight line, and they've done the same strategy as Silverstone. Take the downforce off, allow Max to just send it in the high speed and hope that it sticks together. It does cost them a lot in the low-speed corners, and honestly, Max, compared to Piastri's lap, probably lost like at least 2-3 tenths in just the bus stop chicane, because in the low speeds, the McLaren just eats that Red Bull alive, especially with this downforce setup. The question for many would be, are they going to use this on Sunday? Because Parc Fermé, after tomorrow's sprint, reopens. So as we know, today they were qualifying for the sprint tomorrow. Tomorrow's sprint is going to be in dry conditions. Then the qualifying session later in the day may be on a different downforce setup, because they're preparing for Sunday, where it's probably still going to rain. I don't think Red Bull want to make the same mistake they made in Silverstone, right? So we'll see what they decide to do tomorrow and whether they stick with this low downforce version or whether this was just a plan for the sprint. Now, I will say, it's a big news this, honestly. Gianpiero Lambiase, again, was not in Spa. Now, he missed a Grand Prix a couple of weekends ago. He was in Silverstone, but of course Silverstone is close to presumably where he lives and his family home. He's missing Spa, and the article even describes that he might miss, like, Hungary, right, in another week's time. So again, he's getting replaced by Simon Rennie. But it is, yeah, concerning at this point, right? Because GP doesn't miss Grand Prix, right? Like, this is very unusual. And when he missed a Grand Prix a couple of times ago, I thought it was kind of strange. And now, due to personal circumstances, that's continuing yet again. So hopefully all's well with him, because we know that it's such an important relationship for Max and for Formula 1. But again, another weekend where GP isn't going to be there, and, you know, you could only imagine it's because, well, you know, he was at home in Silverstone effectively, and that's not the case for Spa and potentially for Austria either. So it's unknown if he's going to be back next weekend. We shall see on that one, but potentially a pretty big deal there for Max. Now, I did make the comment about Red Bull a second ago, and I wanted to double down on it really, because several sources told ESPN that Red Bull GmbH, so the Austrian side of the outfit, grew frustrated at how often Christian Horner generated headlines in feuds with the likes of McLaren Zak Brown and Mercedes Toto Wolff. Now, of course, I'm biased. I liked the drama, so, you know, I liked the fact that Horner was not unwilling to get into these situations. Horner knew what he was doing here as well. It's like with Drive to Survive. He took some level of risk with Drive to Survive, opening himself up as he did to the, you know, documentary that was made about his life in some respect in some of the episodes, and being and stepping into a main character role in that series. But Horner did so because it benefited him individually, and, you know, in many respects, I think it benefited Red Bull in terms of giving them the image. This is just what confuses me a little bit, right? Like, Red Bull and Horner and Wheatley and the team they had together over there, always kind of felt like the outliers, the outlaws, the bad boys of Formula One. Like, they'd always push the rules in every regard, whether it comes to, borderline cheating, whether it comes to bringing screenshots of Max not going off track or something to the stewards to try and explain things away, whether it comes to getting involved in some controversies. That was part of what made Red Bull in some regard. And yeah, maybe that was just Horner-led from the top. But it feels like since Mateschitz passing, since he no longer calls the shots, Red Bull have been moving in this more corporate direction. And, Laura McKees is, I think, a perfect exemplary of that. And I think he's going to do a great job for what they want. But it's probably not going to feel quite like Red Bull anymore, And if this was one of their key reasons, I'm not saying this was the only reason by any means, but if it's true that Red Bull, we're just frustrated with Horner making headlines by being Horner. And, if I'm Red Bull thinking the way that I think Red Bull used to think in the way that Mateschitz thought, in my head I'm thinking, well, this is good for the brands because it's on board, right? Like when they broke the cost cap in 2021, if Mercedes did that, they'd get crucified, and they couldn't do it ever because that would bring their whole company into disrepute in some regards, right? Like if Mercedes cheated, went over the cost cap, broke the rules in that sense, that would have major knock-on implications for their actual car brands. For Red Bull, they break the cost cap. It's like, yeah, that's almost on brand for Red Bull, right? So I'm not saying that's necessarily the reason why it happens, but it just feels like Red Bull are going to increasingly be a very different entity. And I don't know if that's going to bring them the success that they think it is, very personally, but I don't know, that's my take on it. You guys may disagree in the comments below. Horner was also talked about with Toto. Toto said that he hasn't spoken with Horner yet, but he does say that he expects Horner to be back at some point. I got to be careful. He could be rocking up to the FIA, and then I'm really screwed. So I thought that was pretty funny. I don't expect Horner to be working with the FIA anytime soon, let's just say that. But Max, he's the only part of Red Bull that still feels like Red Bull to me right now. And Toby Gruner says that AMUS are hearing that he is going to stay for 2026. We talked about it yesterday, that Toto and George, and it seems like there's confidence there that they are going to stay as an outfit over at Mercedes. The feeling is from Red Bull and even from Max that Horner leaving makes no difference for him whether he stays or goes. But there was lots of talk today that Red Bull have been trying to convince Max very heavily to say, look, just see how it goes. Just see how it goes in 2026 on what we can deliver. And apparently Max is kind of on board with that. Red Bull, though, have agreed. So if they are going to do this, if Max is going to stay, he is going to have all the power during 2026, where, no performance clauses, no contract clauses. It's like if he wants to leave, then he can leave. And that is the rumor anyway. Now, Red Bull have basically said, okay, Max, you know what, stay for next year, and if you stay for next year, then if you want to leave, you're free to go, and, we're not going to hold you beyond your will by any means. That is the current rumour. To be fair, what Toto's been saying backs that up too. Toto even says, I'm optimistic that Russell will sleep well in the summer break. So I think that probably tells you what you've got to know. And Toto also says that I want to stay with Kimi and George as it stands. Everything else is not realistic, although you might argue that today could have been different had they had Max Verstappen in the car. But I will say that there's more to it than that because of the damage that certainly Russell seems to suffer. Let's get into qualifying. Hamilton was talking about Ferrari, the excitement about driving for Ferrari every single time he gets in the car. But as he said the other day, he refuses not to win a championship with these guys and is as a result pushing in every single regard to try and help this team turn its fortunes around. Now, they brought a big change this weekend, as we know, the new rear suspension on the car. They also had a couple of different wing modifications that they could run. This was on Hamilton's with seemingly this element at the top here for slightly more downforce. This is Leclerc's with that element removed, maybe a couple of other tweaks in there as well. But fundamentally, they offered a couple of different options to their drivers. And Hamilton, during practice, said the following: I've got a lot of rear locking and instability. So that was, well, a bit of foreshadowing, shall we say, because it seems like whatever setup they ran on Hamilton's car, they were running into, because Hamilton mentioned it earlier in the day, that his car was having a tendency in FP1 to lock up at the rear and just be unstable under braking. Now, this is very interesting, as we know, because they've brought this new rear suspension. They, as a result, are running certain ride heights at the rear of the car that maybe they wouldn't be able to do previously. However, is it really working? And this is the big debate this evening as to whether Ferrari have got this upgrade wrong or whether they're simply not setting it up in the right way. Because the understanding from Ferrari was back in Mugello, where they did the filming day and tested it, they saw the numbers pointing in the right direction. But Hamilton comes out at Belgium today and says, well, the car's locking up underneath me, it's still unstable under braking, and this was how the practice session concluded. Stroll actually did a 1:13 or 1:43.1 here to put himself P1 for a time, and then, of course, all fell apart. And Piastri was very quickly getting to the top. Max did a pretty good lap. Even Russell and Antonelli, like, given they're on the mediums, they weren't far off. They are actually, Mercedes, looking in a pretty decent position, and they seem to have some pace. But unfortunately for them, nowhere near enough pace to cause damage, and certainly not enough pace when we actually got to qualifying. Max was kind of confused at the balance of the car. But it was a very interesting session because Max was running low downforce, was absolutely monstrous in Sector 1 and Sector 3. I mean, he was monstrous through Blanchimont and the corners leading up to the bus stop chicane, but he would lose a couple of tenths easily in the bus stop chicane at the end of the lap. So it's not like his Sector 3s were insane. But Sector 2 was almost a joke. I mean, these were the numbers during FP1, of course, the only practice session of the weekends, where nobody could get near enough within a second of Oscar. Now, coming into this weekend, I made it very clear that my opinion was Piastri was going to win, and my mind certainly hasn't changed as of today. It's a great track for Piastri historically. It's not a great track for Lando historically. I mean, that car is unbelievably mighty, not only everywhere they go, but especially at Spa. It's just, I don't understand how you can beat him. I mean, Max did manage to beat Lando somehow today, and I'm sure that Lando will be poring over the VOD tonight to try and figure out how, because Piastri's lap, like, I watched the onboard after of Piastri's pole lap today, which was a track record, by the way, and it was not mistake-free. Like, it was a great lap, don't get me wrong, it was a great lap. But it wasn't perfect. Like, I think Piastri will look back at that lap and say that there was maybe a tenth and a half in there. Like, I think he probably feels like there was more time in that car, which makes Norris's, delta today, not confusing exactly, because we maybe see this on occasion, but Lando will certainly be, I don't know, it's an interesting one for Lando fans this evening to think that he was half a second, 6/10 off where Piastri was, and it's not like Piastri had a phenomenal, it was a phenomenal lap, but, like, if you watch the onboard, turn 14, Le Com, couple of corners where Piastri will probably feel like there was a bit more time. Most of it, though, was absolutely dialed, and that is key to note, because Pouon, I don't know if he was fully flat today. I'm kind of assuming that they would have been, and maybe even Verstappen was as well. I guess we'll see Yellowstetter do a video on it very shortly to look at some of the telemetry data. But wow, like, that McLaren, unbelievable around this track, and it's just mesmerizing how good they are everywhere. The RB19 was the most dominant car ever in Formula 1 when it comes to percentage of races won. The W11 is still the fastest car ever, and I'll kind of explain why in a second, even though the lap time was beaten today emphatically by Max and by Oscar actually at the end of the session. But the MCL 39 might be the best that we've seen in this context, like, it's the final year of the regulations. It should be closer than this, but yet the McLaren just has no weaknesses. It's unbelievable. Every tyre compound, every corner type, so planted. It's amazing what McLaren have done this year with that machine. And yes, maybe they have more drag than other cars, but there's, it's a trade-off there, right? And yeah, they're obviously running a little bit more downforce here anyway than Max is, which is also contributing to some of the straight line speed differentials. But SQ1 got underway in dramatic fashion. So Antonelli goes off at Stavlo, all the way over the gravel, picks up a load of damage, and this is a tricky corner, very tricky corner, tendency to understeer, to wash out wide. You've put a wheel on the gravel, you might be in the gravel. If you get a snap of oversteer on the corner entry, you're going to be in the gravel. So, disaster really for Antonelli here, and because of this, even more disastrous, he actually caused Russell to also go through some gravel and picked up his own damage, because the Mercedes actually looked kind of fast, but Antonelli at this moment, it compromised Russell's situation as well. And then this was Lewis Hamilton, and this is not how you're meant to enter the bus stop chicane, because he is sideways here after locking the rear of the car. So his lap was cooked at this point, he was off, and they came back onto the track. We can look at the onboards here just to kind of digest exactly what occurred. So Hamilton under braking, and just as he tries to turn into the corner here, the rears just lock up and he's absolutely off. Like, they just locked him immediately, and actually Anthony Davidson listened to this and says, as far as he's concerned, he doesn't really think this was driver error. his assessment is that the rear tyres just locked under, like the rear axle, really even before Hamilton turned into the corner, were just basically locked up before they'd even got to this point, which raises some very, very interesting questions. Now, understandably, Hamilton didn't want to say much on this. We will say what he said in a second. But Brake Booster was talking about it, of course, big Ferrari guy, saying that, the chronic understeer, to mitigate it, at low speeds, they've got to use the brakes very aggressively to rotate the car, and the balance issue is causing these problems. Dr. Robbs actually was commenting on it as well and kind of suggesting that the changes of the suspension that they have made may have led to this situation. It's difficult exactly to analyse. There's other commentators that are saying, well, this is more of a setup-related thing, the way that they're implementing the new rear suspension, not necessarily about the rear suspension itself, but it's tough to imagine this is not only a coincidence, right? When Hamilton turns up in his first practice session of the day, says that his rears are unstable and his rear axle is locking, gets into his lap in qualifying, locks up the rears, and in sprint qualifying, you don't really have too much opportunity to go again. You've only got to use, you've only got one set of tyres as well. So if you cook your tyres with a spin, that's it for you, you're dusted. And that's the big talking point of the day, because it finds it difficult to believe it's a coincidence that they mess around with the rear suspension, they bring an upgrade to it, they've got to find a setup that's going to work. I think for Ferrari and Hamilton, the hope will be that actually the rear suspension does work, just the setup they've gone for is causing these issues. But it feels like it's not like they've slapped this new rear suspension on the car and everything's beautiful all of a sudden, and the F25 is unleashing the potential that they saw in the simulator. It was Albon, Hülkenberg, Hamilton, Colapinto, Antonelli. They were out on SQ1. Again, with SQ1, with the way that it is, with the one set of mediums, it always causes a little bit of chaos. And Hamilton says, look, not much to say. I spun. Obviously, I'm massively frustrated. Hopefully, tomorrow will be better. So we'll see. I think for Ferrari, it's interesting because they got the sprint, then they can change the car if they want going into... So I think tomorrow really will be a good testing bed, good testing session in the sprint for Hamilton, basically, starting from P18 on the grid, and then in qualifying they can use some of their learnings. Now, Hamilton went on to say this, the rear lockup, yes, I think it's the first time it's happened to me in my career, which is a very interesting assessment. Now, we know that on these Ferraris, they've got Brembo brakes, the Mercedes used to use Carbon Industries, so Hamilton's not been used to these brakes, sure, but for him to say that, that's basically never happened to him before is maybe telling that it could be more car related and more mechanical. There's a day to work, we'll try and do something, hopefully we'll do better tomorrow. The situation's extremely frustrating, the situation's not great. Now Fred Vasseur, like he does, says something kind of interesting. Vasseur is always very keen to blame the drivers if possible, and maybe it's justified, I don't know, but Vasseur always tends to do this. He never wants to blame the engineers or the car or the setup or anything like that. So yeah, he says the first mistake, he was distracted by Tsunoda going through the dust, because you can clearly see a big cloud on the onboard footage, and then of course the second one, the big one that decided whether he was actually going to make it through or not. I believe he was just a bit too aggressive on the brakes. So yeah, I guess we'll see what the data says this evening. We have room for improvement, says Vasseur. We must continue to understand the car with the new suspension. The data collected is in the expected direction. So they're saying that everything is okay, maybe just the way that they're setting things up isn't going to plan. And De Keyser says that with the brake bias balanced towards the rear of the car, they found themselves pretty much causing locking, not necessarily related to the suspension, but potentially related to what they've changed on the car. It'd be tough to imagine that it's otherwise. Now, this was George Russell running over some gravel, I think, because of Antonelli's spin, or at least to some degree because of it. That gave him some damage. After the session, he actually said it straight up that we saw some damage on the car. That's got to be a factor. And then we get SQ2 underway. So Russell's actually out of SQ2 here. Max put in a good lap to go 1:41.5, but that's still nowhere near the lap time that we are about to see. Lando eventually went 1:41.4 on his third run on these mediums, but the level of evolution was crazy, right? Piastri's lap was a 1:42. And then the next session, he did a 1:40 points, right? Now, there was insane track evolution here. Everyone crossing the line was just going faster and faster and faster. And for Lando to go P1 on his third run with those tyres showed that there was mega evolution. The Hasses were up there. Bortoletto put in a great lap. Gasly did as well. Sainz, Hadjar put his car third at a point, and then about 30 seconds later he was 9th, and Lawson was 5th and ended up 11th. Russell was out in 13th, and it was Piastri on the bubble. They were so close. Tsunoda, had he gone out a little later, Lawson, had he gone out a little later, they would have knocked Piastri clean out of qualifying here because they would have had that extra little bit of track evolution. So, yeah, remarkable stuff, really. Piastri just about survives. They have some serious plot armor right now. And then Piastri, as he was frankly always going to do, just delivered an absolutely spectacular lap in the final part of qualifying. This was an unbelievable lap. Max put in a 140.9, and I thought that was a really mega lap because, you know, to put that in with the car that he's got, Hamilton's record in 2020 with the W11 was a 141.2, and that has been considered, you know, a very challenging time to beat. Now, the reason why there's a bit of a caveat here is because in 2020, expecting a wet race on the Sunday, I think, so they slapped a load more downforce on the car. So the W11, I'm sure, could have been quicker than that during qualifying that year, but the setup they went for meant they were quite slow on the straights, really, the W11 in 2020. But understandably mighty in the middle sector, where Hamilton famously was flat out through Pouon. So this year, it just seems like the McLaren is able to do both, right? Like, it doesn't lose that much time on the straights, and yet it's still mighty in the middle sector. So for Piastri, and I know that there was some resurfacing, I think, of the track redone. So, you know, there's obviously some caveats there, because Hamilton's record in the W11 of all things wouldn't get beaten by 7/10 without some degree of a caveat in play. But still, I mean, what a lap from Oscar. This was big for him, right, in terms of confidence after what's happened the last couple of weekends. Norris been closing that gap in the championship. For Piastri to come out with a big statement here, and yeah, Lando's lap was way off where Oscar was. He was 6/10 off where Oscar was, and that meant that he was behind Max. So that could be a big swing this weekend, right? Like, Piastri, I think it's a good weekend for Piastri to have a sprint weekend, right? Because it means there's more points up for grabs. It means that Piastri is so good around this circuit, and clearly right now far more comfortable than Lando. But to be honest, the McLaren is just so good that, I mean, Lando being 6/10 off was still third. And we're still third kind of comfortably in the end, right? Because if we look at the overall qualifying times, Piastri was miles up the road, then Verstappen, Lando was third, Leclerc was fourth, Ocon ended up fifth, Sainz in sixth, Behrman seventh, Gasly eighth, which would be the final points-paying position of the sprint tomorrow, Hadjar and then Bortoletto rounding out qualifying. So, yeah, truly remarkable turn of events here, really. But it's also worth noting, Verstappen is running low downforce, so what are we expecting leading into Le Combe tomorrow? Coming out of La Source, running up Eau Rouge and Radion and down the Kemmel Straight, Verstappen's got to be feeling confident to be leading into Le Combe, and, you know, after that, who knows what's going to be happening. So, just as we've done the last few days, this is the forecast for Sunday. Tomorrow, looking dry, pretty much. Sunday, though, it is still looking like rain, maybe some thundery showers. So, yeah, I think tomorrow they will have to make some interesting decisions when it comes to what they're going to do with their setup after the sprint. So very much interested in your thoughts on all this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.